Hey everybody, this is a chapter from a book titled The Prophet's Army, Trotskyists in America, 1928 to 1941. This chapter, according to Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union, has a lot of very good information covering the split in the Socialist Workers' Party, the Trotskyist Party in uh, in the late 1930s. That would eventually culminate in the split between the Socialist Workers' Party under the leadership of James P. Cannon and the Workers' Party under the leadership of Max Shachtman. So I'm probably not going to read this whole book. This is for information that could help me in my thesis research. But hopefully you'll get something out of it. Okay. So, Trotskyists in Crisis. Section A, Seeds of Schism. The expulsion from the Norman Thomas Party ushered in the next period for American Trotskyists. Just 3 months later, another of the many small splits that afflicted the group took place. The lines of the quarrel that in November 1937 prompted 12 comrades to walk out were prophetic. New section, the quote, political question, end quote. James Burnham in 1936 had begun to doubt a cardinal Trotskyist principle, that the Soviet Union remained a worker state although degenerated. To elaborate, property was still in the hands of the people, but an unscrupulous bureaucracy had usurped control. As the only existing worker state, the Soviet Union still merited unconditional defense if at war with capitalist powers. But Burnham doubted that it warranted defense. Speaking at the Socialist Party convention in 1936, James Burnham said the USSR had become, through its alliance system, a dupe of imperialism. Now Burnham was bold indeed to question the party line, and it brought him into conflict with the Bolshevik theory of party organization. To doubt was to violate discipline. The seeds of dispute, crisis, and schism were thus sown. In the fall of 1937, Joe Carter and Burnham questioned the entire official analysis. Soviet property relations, they found, were not those of a worker state because the proletariat did not manage or control the means of production. The state, after all, is the sum of the tools of social and political coercion, army, police, courts, prisons, and bureaucracy, to aid those who did manage or control. As the big bourgeoisie benefited from these tools under German and Italian fascism, so in Russia the bureaucracy, a new ruling class, reaped the rewards of the state. Quote, within the last 2 or 3 years it is completed that divorce from the proletariat, and consequently the state is no longer a workers' state, end quote. Nor was it a bourgeois state, and to defend it, quote, unconditionally, end quote, would do nothing to restore the revolutionary ideal. The challenges spurred Trotsky, who exercised great authority in determining the stand on international questions, to write heated rebuttals from Coyoacán, which is the neighborhood in Mexico City that Trotsky lived in at this time. The bureaucracy could not be called a class, Trotsky said. Rather, the bureaucracy was a, quote, clique, end quote, as class was determined by the relationship to the means of production. Property remained in state hands. The bureaucracy simply had illegal but temporary control. Accordingly, the cause of world revolution demanded a continued pledge of unconditional defense. When the issues were articulated at the Chicago Conference of the Expelled Branches in November 1937, a group of young comrades agreed with Mavericks Burnham and Carter and came under Arne Swabick's sharp rebuke. I want to see if Arne Swabick had anything substantial on their Wikipedia page. It says, I don't know if I'm saying it right. It might be Arne, it might be Arna, but it's ARNESWABECK. Arne Swabik lived from 1890 to 1986 and was an American communist leader. Swabik was born in Denmark and emigrated to the United States, where Swabik became one of the founding members of the Communist Party. In the late 1920s, Arne Swabik was expelled from the party as a Trotskyist and worked together with James P. Cannon and other American Trotskyists to create the Socialist Workers' Party. Swabik visited Leon Trotsky in his exile in Turkey in 1933. In the late 1950s, Arne Swabik became a Maoist and left the Socialist Workers' Party in 1967. For a number of years, Swabik was in the Progressive Labor Party. Swabik wrote the book entitled The Split of the Socialist Party, which was published by New England Free Press in 1969. In 1980, Swabik appeared as himself in the movie Reds. He is briefly interviewed as one of a series of elderly witnesses to events described in the movie. That's interesting. If you've ever seen the movie Reds, it's a good movie. It's got Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton in the movie. Warren Beatty playing John Reed, who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, and it's about their life together. It's a good movie, but in the beginning of the movie, it has a bunch of interviews with people who knew John Reed. I feel ashamed that I don't remember her name. Now I have to look that up. Fuck. Who did she play? Louise Bryant. That's who she played. That's the name. Okay. So that's who Arne Swabik is. So back to the text. When the issue was articulated at the Chicago Conference of the Expelled Branches in November 1937, a group of young comrades agreed with Mavericks Burnham and Carter and came under Arne Swabik's sharp rebuke. Quote, "All of you must give up your anti-working class views regarding the workers' fatherland, the Soviet Union, if you wish to remain here. As long as private property and the means of production and exchange are still nationalized, the Soviet Union ... must be defended," end quote. You know, I'm not, I know that, people that, Workers' World Party or whatever, I can't remember the guy's name. I know that they, not to look that up. Sam something. Sam Marcy. But he became a Maoist. I mean, well, the Workers' World Party became more and more like third worldist. Let me see what it says here. It says Marxist-Leninist Communist Party. Yeah, but I mean, I don't know if Arne Swabik was related to these people at all. It doesn't seem like he was. It seems like the Workers' World Party is a distinct thing from the Progressive. It's definitely a distinct thing from the Progressive Labor Party, but you usually don't hear of people going from, with the exception of Sam Marcy and the people around Workers' World Party. It doesn't seem like you really see like a Trotskyist grouping go back to Stalinism. But if you know of other instances of that kind of thing, please reference that in the comments. But Arne Swabik leaving this SWP to become a Maoist is an interesting thing to have happened. And to be clear, Maoism is a form of Stalinism. It's not whatever anyone might tell you. Not that you need that there's a distinction on the fundamentals between. Don't let anyone ever tell you that try to water down what Maoism is to you. It's definitely a form of Stalinism, and any honest Maoist is pretty open about that. Some, they water it down. Anyway, while Cannon berated Burnham for mongrelization of theory, 12 members, including Harry Roskolenko, Max Geltman, and Max Eastman's sons Dan, led by the artist Attila Salem, walked out into the night. I don't know who any of these people are. Well, I know who Max Eastman is, of course, but I need to look these people up. Harry Roskolenko lived from 1907 to 1980 and was an American author of poetry, novels, travelogues, screenplays, and journalism. It doesn't really seem to say anything here about his politics. Here. I don't know who Max Geltman is. Who's Max Geltman? Max Geltman. Doesn't seem to say anything. I'm seeing something for a Geldman, G-E-D. Max Geldman. I don't know. It's not saying anything from that. Max Eastman's son, Dan Eastman. Dan Eastman. Trotsky. Not really seeing anything on him. And the last person here, Attilio Salem. Looks like he's an artist. These are interesting paintings. Wikipedia. Come on. Yeah, it says that this guy, oh, interesting. Okay, so here's something. I'm sorry for anyone who's listening to this and is having to hear me type and chop away at the keyboard. It seems like they were in a, this person, Attilio Salem, formed a group called the Revolutionary Marxist League, which was a small communist party that existed from 1938 to 1939 or 1940 in New York City. It was led by Meldon Yerger and Attilio Salem. It says it was a Trotskyist party. It says it merged with the Workers' Party, but what that actually says the Marxist Workers League. Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to see if it has any connection to the Workers' Party. It doesn't appear that way. It says that the Marxist Workers League merged with another small sect, the Revolutionary Marxist League, by Meldon Yerger to create a group called the Workers' Party. This new sect appears to have died out quickly, such that it had gone out of existence before the Shachtmanite Workers' Party was formed in 1940. Yeah, I don't see anything about these individuals. So, while Cannon berated Burnham for mongrelization of theory, 12 members, including Harry Roskolenko, Max Geldman, Max Eastman's son Dan, led by the artist Attilio Salem, walked out into the night. Relieved, Roskolenko recalled, quote, "I was out of it all at last," end quote. I forgot to say that Max Geltman guy, it appears that there's an obituary for him on Against the Current. Within 2.5 years, half the party would have left, in part over the same question, the culmination of a process reaching back not merely to 1936, but to 1932. New section. Founding the Socialist Workers' Party and the Fourth International. On December 31st, 1937 and January 1st, 1938, a reported 100 delegates gathered in Chicago at a, quote, emergency convention, end quote, and heard Al Goldman open the meeting, then cheered addresses by such regulars as Cannon, Shachtman, and Dunn. Al Goldman, Trotskyist. Says that Albert Goldman, who lived from 1897 to 1960, was a Belarusian-born American political and civil rights lawyer closely associated with the American Communist movement. Albert Goldman broke with the mainline Communist Party USA in 1933, joining the Trotskyist opposition, in which he would be a leading participant for the better part of the next 2 decades. Albert Goldman is best remembered as a defendant and lead defense attorney in the 1941 Smith Act prosecution of the leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party. For opposing America's involvement in World II, Goldman was sentenced to 16 months in prison. Young People's Socialist League delegates met at the same time, but since 90% of the younger Socialist Party members had left during the expulsions, efforts to revive the Young People's Socialist League within the party failed. Both conventions roundly and ritualistically denounced the Popular Front and class collaboration as support for LaGuardia in the New York's mayoralty contest, and then pledged loyalty to their own Socialist Workers' Party and its Declaration of Principles. Standard disclaimers were trotted out in the Declaration. Fascism mobilized desperate middle classes in the interest of big capital. Because the United States shuddered, quote, in the final throes of capitalism, end quote, the only road away from war and repression was to eliminate capitalism. Through overthrow by means of, quote, class organs like Soviets, end quote, Bolshevik Leninists could take power and inaugurate the workers' state, quote, a temporary political instrument, end quote, needed to defend the revolution against class enemies aiming to abolish, quote, the necessity of state coercion, that is, to do away with itself, with any form of state whatever, end quote. Finally, these efforts would bring in a socialist society with planned production, a labor force of free producers, and the disappearance of, quote, socially useless classes, end quote. The Declaration then scrutinized radical parties for their potential to lead world revolution, finding all but one useless for the task. That one was the Socialist Workers' Party, instrument of world salvation because the only collection of true revolutionaries. Then, because the goal was, quote, to mobilize the American masses for struggle against American capitalism and for American capitalism's overthrow, end quote, the Socialist Workers' Party would have to devise ways to recruit among the middle classes, quote, Negroes and other oppressed racial groups, end quote, unemployed youth, trade unionists, and, quote, colonial peoples, end quote. The comrades would have to show each group in its best that its best interest lay in endorsing Trotskyist positions on such global issues as the clash of democracy with fascism, quote, imperialist war, end quote, and of major significance the Soviet Union. On the Russian question, despite Burnham's and Carter's outburst and declaration plainly stated that the workers' state survived and all workers had the duty to defend Russia unconditionally. But the seeds of doubt planted by Burnham and Carter had begun to germinate. The resolution on the Soviet Union failed to affirm Trotsky's uncompromising stand. The resolution on the Soviet Union introduced a modification. Since the bureaucracy was not a class, nor were the Stakhanovites, the pace-setting production workers on which the new bureaucracy relied, a class, quote, both contained elements of a new, i.e., a capitalist class, end quote. The Soviet system was neither socialism nor capitalism. Bernhard said that it was neither a workers' nor a bourgeois state. The resolution nevertheless demanded, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, of the, quote, imperative duty of the international proletariat, end quote, to forestall capitalist restoration, but clearly Burnham and Carter had made inroads. The Socialist Workers' Party viewed European war as inevitable and United States intervention, quote, to maintain its own power and profits, end quote, as certain. Therefore, it opposed any involvement pitting the United States against the Soviet Union. The Trotskyist, quote, revolutionary defensist, end quote, argument seemed intact, but a fresh class analysis had almost surfaced. A renewed commitment to democratic centralism phrased in the resolution on party organization ensured loyalty to defensism if future conventions voted that policy. With the birth of the new, quote, pure, end quote, party came a desire to found formally the Fourth International. For the September 1938 founding conference, Trotsky wrote the, quote, transition program, end quote, under the sweeping title, The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International, which is on this channel. It restated the party line and beckoned workers everywhere to rally for future triumph, quote, under the banner of the Fourth International, end quote. At the spring plenum in 1938, the comrades discussed, approved, and adopted Trotsky's blueprint. If Burnham and Carter had objections, they kept silent. Prognoses of war were not ill-founded. Axis powers were on the move. In March 1938, the last of the Moscow trials was underway. Mussolini had invaded Ethiopia, Japanese forces had occupied Manchuria, and that month Hitler moved into Austria. In the United States, the House of Representatives debated and barely rejected the Ludlow Amendment, which would have mandated a national referendum before Congress could declare war, except in case of invasion. Opposing it, President Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull talked of world responsibilities and commended collective security to deter military aggression. In the spirit of the Popular Front, Earl Browder endorsed collective security to save the world from, quote, catastrophe. Trotskyists believed approval of Roosevelt's collective security anomalous for revolutionists. What a calamity that the requirements of Soviet foreign policy had prompted American communists to turn their backs on class struggle for the sake of national unity. Collective security was simply a design to defend Anglo-American imperialism. Answering historian Charles A. Beard, who recommended that the United States stay aloof from European and Asian entanglements, Burnham observed that America's intricate and permanent bonds with the world market system and commitment to uphold world capitalism made isolation impossible. War would erupt and the United States would intervene. In this atmosphere bristling with the amassing of armaments, the whetting of nationalist fervor, and the stoking of international hatreds, Trotskyists founded the Fourth International. Delegates from 11 countries met in Paris at Alfred Rosmer's home, publicly reported as, quote, somewhere in Switzerland, end quote. September 3rd, 1938, for a one-day session over which Max Shachtman presided. Little debate occurred. Pierre Neville gave the main report, then delegates merely adopted Trotsky's transition program. They quarreled briefly over the pretentious ring of the term, quote, international, end quote, for so small a movement, then with Trotsky's admonition in mind, kept the term and rejected an alternate label. Quote, movement for the Fourth International, end quote, in favor of the, quote, Fourth International, end quote. The little group optimistically appointed a, quote, international secretariat, end quote, and a subsecretariat, and talked grandly of centralizing operations. In high hopes they adjourned, dedicated, in Shachtman's words, to, quote, go ahead under the banner of the Fourth International with our old convictions, our tested principles, and with no doubts as to the final outcome, end quote. Shachtman said that the Congress climaxed 15 years of struggle. 5 years before, Trotsky called for a new international, and 4 years earlier, the, quote, Pact of Four, end quote, delegates had met. The nascent organization had even boasted a, quote, secretary, end quote, Rudolf Clement, who allegedly fell victim to the GPU Soviet secret police in midsummer 1938. Who's Rudolf Clement? Rudolf Clement. Rudolf Clement lived from 1908 to 1938 and was a German member of the Trotskyist left opposition and Fourth International, fluent in 5 languages. Rudolf Clement joined Trotsky as his secretary in Principal Turkey in 1933, where he learned a 6th language, Russian. Clement accompanied Trotsky to France, where he remained after Trotsky was expelled and ultimately found a home in Mexico. Clement came to lead Trotsky's international secretariat from France. Clement was assassinated by the Stalinist NKVD in Paris while preparing a political report that included an investigation of NKVD agent Mark Zborovsky, who infiltrated the Trotskyist movement in France. So, back to the text. The nascent organization had even boasted a, quote, secretary, Rudolf Clement, who allegedly fell victim to the GPU Soviet secret police in midsummer 1938. Socialist Appeal melodramatically reported that Clement was, quote, kidnapped from Paris at midnight, end quote, taken to Spain and murdered, his headless and legless body found there later, a sure sign, Trotskyists believed. The Comintern thought the Fourth International was a real threat. Reviewing party history to this climax, Trotsky noted 3 stages. The first had been the propaganda sect period of 1928 to 1934. The second, that of fusion politics and trying to make reformist parties the vehicle for revolutionary activities, mid-1934 to mid-1938. This third stage began in September 1938 with the founding of the Fourth International, deemed mandatory after massive expulsions from socialist parties, including the Second International. His millennial vision would remain a mirage because, as Trotsky could not foresee, the Congress portended a significant event. Sylvia Agaloff of the New York branch came and was introduced by Ruby Weil, a former Mustite, to Trotsky's future assassin, whom she would in all innocence gain access to Trotsky's private quarters in Coyoacán. Sylvia Agaloff. Let's see who Sylvia Agaloff is. There's something from Workers' Liberty, but no, there's no, Sylvia Agaloff, Ruby Weil. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for her either. His millennial vision would remain a mirage because, as Trotsky could not foresee, the Congress portended a significant event. Sylvia Agaloff of the New York branch came and was introduced by Ruby Weil, a former Mustite, to Trotsky's future assassin, for whom she would in all innocence gain access to Trotsky's private quarters in Coyoacán. The Fourth International amounted to little. Isaac Deutscher called it a, quote, stillbirth, end quote, for, quote, there was no revolutionary movement to breathe life into it, end quote. It was, quote, unreal. Another scholar believed it failed to grow because Trotsky floundered as leader, did nothing to ensure succession, and so, quote, doomed the Fourth International as an effective organization, end quote. Quote, Trotsky was admirably suited to attaining power, end quote, the argument ran, quote, but not to holding it, end quote. So the matter of succession was never even raised. Trotsky lived exactly 2 years after the founding conference, and those years were in exile. Trotsky's loyal followers were no substitute for the personal leadership he might have exercised by his presence at conferences. But even had this been possible, Marxist revolutionary movements were doomed in the period immediately ahead. Stalin dissolved the Comintern in mid-1943, and the Socialist International remained ineffective too, as demands of World War II, Soviet military expansionism, and nationalist revolutions in developing nations channeled energies. New section. The charge of party conservatism. Had the party grown conservative? In its 11 years, a specific style of leadership had evolved to which members were now habituated. Initially, the support comrades gave a strong leader seemed justified in terms of Bolshevik discipline. But instead of the will of the membership, through the majorities taken at annual conventions, democratic centralism, over time forceful, even domineering personalities came to exert excessive sway over policies. A kind of enforced consensus reflecting powerful leaders' views emerged in place of democratic centralism, and as a result, new faces, new ideas, and new leadership talent were shut out. Perhaps factionalism and the leadership cult are endemic in radical politics, but plainly reform was in order by 1939. World events indirectly commanded a decision on reform, what seemed capitulation of the workers' state to a National Socialist regime in the Nazi Soviet Pact of August 22, 1939, added to the German invasion of Poland, signaling the onset of World War II, forced American radicals to review their official, quote, lines, end quote, on European governments. In the process of review, the Trotskyist long-festering hostilities burst open and the need for party reform was vigorously debated. So it happened that with centripetal force, personal antipathies, need for reform, and world events precipitated the crisis of 1940. Two interrelated but distinct issues opened the quarrel. The political question involved the party line dictated by Trotsky on the Soviet Union. Did Russia still merit the, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, of Marxists? The other issue centered on the right or lack of it within Bolshevik form of comrades to question publicly a party stand, even though the, quote, stand might have been taken after factional intrigue and bullying. This was the organizational question. Burnham had, of course, already raised both issues in 1937. Now world events shoved them once more into mid-arena. The debate was on, and Trotsky intruded at every turn, writing under a variety of pseudonyms: Lund, Crux, W. Rourke, V.T. O'Brien, even Your Old Man. The resolution of both questions would decide the fate of party reform. At a plenum before the July 1939 convention, Shachtman volunteered organizational suggestions and reported on party leadership in order to provoke intra-party discussions that might lead to needed reforms. First, he wished to see the power of the bureaucracy reduced. Second, he wished to see Marxist praxis implemented. Quote, revolutionary ideas tested in the crucible of action, end quote. Significant roles going to young people rather than, quote, hallowed leaders, end quote. Loyal Cannon supporters distrusted Shachtman's motives and viewed his proposals as an attack on Cannon, so the National Committee rejected them on the spurious ground that such matters had to be decided locally. Cannon's undisputed leadership had long rankled in Shachtman's breast. So too had Cannon's special favored relationship with Trotsky, who appreciated Cannon's unassailable proletarian, syndicalist, and communist background, particularly since the membership comprised only 1/6 industrial workers. This, quote, working-class party, end quote, had its greatest strength in its city intellectual and student radical contingents, and Trotsky, yearning to reverse this, catered to Cannon. Quarreling between Cannon and Shachtman over admission of younger forces into leadership stemmed from 1932. Already by June 1932, Aborn, Glotzer, and Shachtman noted on, quote, ingrowing conservatism, end quote, in the leadership, and recommended that the tiny Communist League of America, quote, refresh the ranks with new forces and transform our National Committee into a working body alive and energetic, end quote. Citing Cannon for 4 evidences of poor leadership, they noted that after October 1928, Cannon, quote, began to, quote, droop, end quote, and let others do his work, saying, quote, it was, quote, a protracted uphill struggle, so cool off, hotheads, end quote, a rationale for conservatism and drift, end quote. Second, Cannon resisted any challenge to his entrenched position from new faces and concocted what Aborn, Glotzer, and Shachtman labeled the, quote, gestation theory. It might be supposed to be theory, there might be a typo there. Theoy is what is on the text. The, quote, gestation theory, end quote, or the, quote, legend of the historic left, end quote, calculated to convince comrades to accord, quote, a special privileged significance to those who once had formed part of the Cannon group in the party, end quote. Cannon commanded deference through, quote, repeated reference to his remarkable qualifications, end quote, his proletarian IWW and Communist Party background. Third, Cannon took long absences from duty in 1929 to 1930 due to, quote, personal difficulties, end quote, undefined, leaving affairs in the hands of trusted cohorts. And last, when present, he finagled to keep criticism of his leadership and views not in accord with his own out of the party press. Although the 1932 quarrel, which briefly threatened split, resolved itself later in pledges of unity, lines had been drawn. Thereafter, Shachtman was found on the side of innovation and collective leadership, whether through envy and a wish to see Cannon displaced or through true respect for youthful ability and eagerness for fresh approaches, and Cannon just as consistently opposed reform, whether Cannon dreaded loss of status in the party, or whether as dedicated revolutionary, Cannon sincerely wanted to preclude dilution of doctrine. Neither Cannon nor Shachtman reported the early quarrel in their memoirs, but the alignments carried faithfully over the years into the crisis of 1939 and 1940 intended to deflect and perpetuate the age-old division within radical movements between the intelligentsia and the working class element. Footnote. Shachtman kept with him the, quote, city intellectuals, end quote, Carter, Emmanuel Geltman, Glotzer, Aborn, Burnham, C.L.R. James, Dwight MacDonald, Isidore Byrne, E.R. McKinney, B.J. Wittick, the literary figures who dabbled briefly in revolutionary politics such as Leslie Fiedler, Irving Howe, and Saul Bellow, and of course the youth whom he championed. Cannon's support largely came from trade union circles, Minneapolis being a particular stronghold in contributing Vincent Ray Dunn, Dobbs, Skoglund, and university professor Grace Carlson. Swabick backed Cannon, as did George Clark, Burt Cochran, Charles Curtis, Murray Weiss, Sam Gordon, Al Russell, the two, quote, city intellectuals, end quote, Felix Morrow of New York and Al Goldman of Chicago, and the budding theoretician who would one day take the position Shachtman had held in the American section, George Novak. Last but not least, Leon Trotsky was found regularly on the side of Cannon. End footnote. Sorry, one second. New section. Crisis in first phase. Ignoring the National Committee ruling, Shachtman raised both the organizational and the political question at the July 1939 convention. He stood and read his slate for a new National Committee to include, for stability and continuity, a core of old leaders, but adding, quote, new blood, end quote, through a large draft from the YPSL, which is, I believe, is the Young Persons Socialist League. This, he argued, would check growing, quote, routinism and conservatism, end quote. Then he recommended a new post, that of, quote, organization secretary, end quote, a kind of ombudsman. What the hell does that mean? Ombudsman. Do you know what that means? Ombudsman. It says an ombudsman. ombud, ombudswoman, ombudsperson, or public advocate is a government employee who investigates and tries to resolve complaints, usually through recommendations, binding or not, or mediation. They are usually appointed by the government or by parliament, often with a significant degree of independence. Okay. So then Shachtman, back to the text. Then Shachtman recommended a new post, that of, quote, organization secretary, end quote, a kind of ombudsman, to be established within a new, quote, organizational department, end quote. Furious, Cannon assailed the innovations as a plot to overthrow him and attack on his leadership. Cannon then, in parliamentary style, called for a vote of confidence by announcing his term as national secretary had ended and that he would not run for election. In this way, he whipped his faction, quote, a clique of cannon hand raisers, end quote, in Shachtman's words, into line. The structural change was dropped from consideration, and Cannon did not withdraw from service as national secretary. Political committee records showed repeated instances of such leadership called politicking. Certainly, this time his threat put the organizational question into cold storage. Next, Shachtman and C.L.R. James addressed international matters, the political question of the party's position on Stalin's demand for the right to, quote, guarantee, end quote, Poland and the Baltic states against German attack. They also wanted the party to take a stand on any possible pacts predicted by Trotsky between Hitler and Stalin and on the war. But the delegates did not tackle these thorny problems. Procrastination was hardly possible in August when the Nazi-Soviet pact became a reality, followed by dual invasion and division of Poland. The existing loose alignment of Socialist Workers' Party forces polarized and crystallized. Through September 1939, the political committee met bi-weekly, and Shachtman, Aburn, Johnson, Wittick, and others called repeatedly for a plenum to consider questions raised by war. Burnham on September 5th, after almost 2 years of silence, again spoke out against. Burnham on September 5th, after almost 2 years of silence, again spoke out, asking that the Fourth International renounce unconditional defense of the Soviet Union. Under present circumstances, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, was counter-revolutionary, therefore, quote, social patriotic, end quote. Supporting Burnham, Shachtman now branded Russia as, quote, imperialist, end quote. But from Koyoakan, Trotsky rejoined, quote, our house must be kept clean. We have no reason at the present time for changing our principled position in relation to the USSR, end quote. Cannon naturally seconding him and urging that the pact, quote, is new only in the sense that an old policy of Stalin on the field of foreign policy, has reached diplomatic realization through the agreement of Hitler, end quote. Because the economic structure of the Soviet Union had undergone no change, quote, for my part, I am not willing to revise the well-considered decisions of our party convention, end quote. Although Cannon insisted that organization on political questions stay separate, he himself linked them when he said, quote, individual editors at their whim, end quote, had refuted decisions taken at convention, plainly a matter of discipline, and so connected in the closest way to the organizational question. With the issue joined, now even rank-and-file members chose sides and argued, quote, defensism or defeatism, end quote, workers, state, or new class, end quote, collective security or no entangling alliances with capitalist powers, end quote. On the issue of war, for example, would the Socialist Worker Party uphold a, quote, defensive, end quote, war if the, quote, democracies, end quote, Britain, France, the United States, and Russia were called into battle? Was Russia now an imperialist power, or was Stalin simply an agent of imperialism? Burnham, Aburn, and Shachtman became the anti-war faction, insisting, quote, the war is an imperialist war on both sides, end quote, so the revolutionists as a, quote, third camp, end quote, should stand aloof from battle while Axis and allies, including Russia, fought it out, spurning, quote, unconditional or any other kind of defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. This faction gradually drew in students and others from the young persons Young People's Socialist League, who found its stand compelling. George Weissman remembered that as a Trotskyist leader at Harvard University, he tried to soft-pedal the quarreling because students were choosing sides, and of course, party spirit declined. Let's see if there's anything for George Weissman. George Weissman. George Weissman. Trotsky. George Levon Weissman, who lived from the December 14th, 1916 and March 28th, 1985, was an American Marxist activist, journalist, and Socialist Workers' Party leader. Okay. And Weissman says, quote, this is back to the text, quote, I was very naive about it, and the group that called themselves Shachtmanites went to work on them, and the next thing I knew, most of the new ones were converted to that position, end quote. The first verbal matches were on a high plane. Resolutions on the Russian question at the October plenum set forth the contrasting, quote, lines, end quote, and Trotsky gave his side in two eloquent articles, again and once more again on the nature of the USSR and the USSR in war. The USSR in war is on this channel. Again and once more again on the nature of the USSR will be on the channel if it's not already. Burnham hoped the comrades would adopt his and Shachtman's viewpoint by majority vote at the convention in the spring of 1940. The organization question was raised briefly first when Burnham at the plenum asked for a referendum on the war issue. The majority said no, and Trotsky, with tortuous logic, sided with them in the name of democratic centralism. Whoever favored a referendum favored mandates, he wrote. Every local under the system could dictate the vote of its representatives at convention. Whoever recognized such mandates disdained, quote, the highest organ of the party, end quote, the convention. Quote, the party as a centralized whole disappears, end quote. A referendum would subject the party to, quote, influence of the least experienced backward sections, etc., end quote. Because Cannon's position received majorities in the National Committee meeting, the plenum reorganized the political committee to give Cannon a majority. The alignment still had not solidly formed. Aburn and McKinney supported both Cannon's and Shachtman's motions, and Goldman, after having made one motion himself, later stood by Cannon to keep his majority. Cannon summoned the influential Farrell Dobbs, trade unionist Bert Cochran, and Goldman to the plenum. The Cannon group then placated the other side by appointing Wittick, Carter, and Aburn to non-influential party posts, and sent Cannonite Joseph Hansen to Mexico so Trotsky could hear the quarrel from the, quote, proper, end quote, perspective. Buttressing his side, Burnham convinced the Trotskyist sympathizer Dwight MacDonald, brilliant young writer for Partisan Review, that he should formally join the Socialist Workers' Party. In November, the Cannon majority pleaded, quote, financial exigency, end quote, voted one editor on socialist appeal, named Cannonite Felix Morrow to the office, and kept Shachtman as, quote, consultant. Felix Morrow. Felix Morrow was an American communist, political activist, and newspaper editor. In later years, Morrow left the world of politics to become a book publisher. Felix Morrow is best remembered as a factional leader of the American Trotskyist movement. Somehow, Shachtman and Burnham managed to remain editors of New International. Unanimously adopted at the political committee meeting of November 7th was a, quote, statement on party unity, end quote, pledging democratic process for clarifying issues at the next national convention and no expulsions or withdrawals even if the antagonists failed to agree. The, quote, statement, end quote, provided for a commission of 4, 2 from each side, to investigate grievances or violations of discipline. Meanwhile, both factions would go right on collaborating in duties and jointly editing the internal bulletin. Based on the unity resolution, prospects for a compromise seemed bright in November, but even then partisans rallied forces for battle, Cannon often prating of the, quote, lineup, end quote, the theater of operation, national headquarters in New York. Section B, the schism. First section of Section B, crisis in second phase. The organization question precipitated the acrimonious second phase. Burnham asked to have pages of socialist appeal in New International open to full discussion of the issues from both points of view. The National Committee majority turned down the request. Accordingly, on December 13th, Abern, Burnham, Shachtman, and Isidore Byrne drafted for the political committee minority a devastating portrayal of the Socialist Workers' Party as a party corrupted with inner circle rule, a betrayal of democratic centralism, and a party stagnant with do-nothing policies, oblivious of shifts in world politics. I'm not seeing for any Isidore. Thing for Isidore Byrne. Accordingly, on December 13th, Abern, Burnham, Shachtman, and Isidore Byrne drafted for the political committee minority a devastating portrayal of the Socialist Workers' Party as a party corrupted with inner circle rule, a betrayal of democratic centralism, and a party stagnant with do-nothing policies, oblivious of shifts in world politics. Borrowing from the term, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, used by an Italian ex-Trotskyist, Bruno Rizzi, the minority branded the Cannon regime, quote, bureaucratic conservatism, end quote. The indictment written, I think a lot of people would view the notion that they borrowed this term from Rizzi, questionable, especially and I think that like a lot of people, for instance, Hal Draper and I think it's Ernie Habakern, or E. Habakern is usually how he signed his name, highly contest the influence of the notion that Bruno Rizzi was an influence on the minority within the Socialist Workers' Party at this time, or at any time. Hal Draper says something to the effect that, like, Trotsky used Rizzi as a hammer to beat down the minority, or something like that. When they questioned the degenerated worker state thesis. The indictment written by Burnham traced party history to prove Cannon's obsession with personal status and power, a fixation that caused him to place, quote, the organizational question, end quote, first, even while insisting the political question was paramount. Cannon encouraged a, quote, cult of the leader, end quote, and accepted robot like Trotsky's political line, recapitulating it for equally blind acceptance by his clique. In short, Burnham's, quote, war and bureaucratic conservatism, end quote, summarized the dispute smoldering for 9 years. The thrust and priorities of the ensuing debate unveiled Trotsky's peculiar position. Faithful party members, quote, voluntarily and enthusiastically accepted, end quote, Trotsky's total authority, a relationship unduplicated in other radical movements. A chasm in prestige and authority separated, quote, Trotsky at the top and the most prominent of his followers, end quote, with Trotsky gladly receiving the awesome responsibility that, as the, quote, last representative of Marxist internationalism, end quote, Trotsky was the, quote, link between yesterday and tomorrow, end quote. For Shachtman, it was no surprise when he or Burnham wrote articles that Cannon or Goldman never were first to reply. The initial responses setting forth the line of rebuttal always came from Trotsky, quote, he was our opponent, period, end quote. I don't know whose that quote is from, but Trotsky's reply to war and bureaucratic conservatism was not temperate. The internal bulletin, war and bureaucratic conservatism, is an article. I don't have it on the channel, but I should eventually. The internal bulletin must suffice as the vehicle for rebuttal. The debate was to be kept from any, quote, public, end quote, press. Quote, Under such conditions, for the opposition to have their own public paper or magazine is a means not to convince the party, but to appeal against the party to the external world, end quote. Perhaps then one issue of New International could be given over to the discussion, but the arrangement must give the last word to the majority. After all, said Trotsky, the Burnham group had a primitive argument and could not win in a theoretical fight. They did seek publicity, perhaps, quote, to justify themselves before democratic public opinion, to shout to all the Eastmans, Hooks, and others that they, are not so bad as we, end quote. The charge of bureaucratic conservatism incensed him, and in a final crescendo, Trotsky exhumed the old epithet, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, to pitch at Burnham, Shachtman, Aburn, and the rest, adding in a furious postscript to one of his letters, quote, it is absolutely sure that the Stalinist agents are working in our midst with the purpose to sharpen the discussion and provoke a split, end quote. Before the July 1939 convention, Trotsky had written canon that the superabundance of middle-class elements in the large cities, especially New York, spent too much time discussing among themselves and too little time recruiting. From time to time, he had reminded his followers that petty bourgeois comrades should be outnumbered by proletarians for their tendency to scorn discipline and follow individual whimsy posed a danger to a, quote, combat party, end quote. On December 13th, Trotsky answered with a major article focusing on philosophical incompatibilities, pragmatism pitted against dialectical materialism. It was a reply to an earlier essay by Burnham and Shachtman, quote, intellectuals in retreat, end quote, in which both had revealed their growing doubts about the relevance of the dialectic. Trotsky barred his anti-intellectualism. Trotsky bared his anti-intellectualism, astonishing in a man characterized by friend and foe alike as an intellectual of high caliber and who at no time except during schoolboy odd jobs had lived a working-class life. A proletarian could only think dialectically, Trotsky was sure, whereas petty bourgeois prejudiced towards pragmatism was reinforced in academia, the whole process leading him farther and farther away from a revolutionary analysis and from usefulness to a combat party. The dialectic, the only truly scientific mode of thought, made obsolete Aristotelian logic with its static view of reality. Hegel and Marx had displaced Aristotle. Similarly, Darwin's dynamic description of biological unfolding supplanted Linnaeus' static, quote, immutability of species, end quote. A motor force propels human society, slow growth periodically precipitating conflict of opposites, revolutions as shells of older social systems explode. Having defined and defended his philosophical base, Trotsky addressed the organizational question. The dialectic was at work inside the Socialist Party itself, causing the intra-party quarrel, he claimed. Shachtman and Burnham, petty bourgeois eclectics, had shifted from a correct position to a regressive position, quote, with its tinge of academic pedantry and journalistic impressionism, end quote. Of course, Aburn, too, had assailed, quote, unconditional defense, end quote. But after all, said Trotsky, Aburn's struggle against Cannon was the oldest struggle in the party. Aburn's was, quote, a propagandist group, petty bourgeois in its social composition, end quote, clashing with progressive proletarian party and now joined by Burnham and Shachtman. Comrades should, quote, reject the anti-Marxian novelties of the opposition and guarantee party unity, end quote, for, quote, if the party as a whole should take the road of the opposition, it could suffer complete destruction, end quote. Trotsky's second article, quote, from a scratch to the danger of gangrene, end quote, which is going to be on this channel. I have it recorded in my phone. I just have not uploaded it. Thrashed the theoretical enemy with physiological metaphors as scornful rhetoric mounted. And it is indeed scornful. It seems, it's like, if you read In Defense of Marxism, at least in my opinion, it's very limited on substantial content. And it's usually just saying, these are just a bunch of bourgeois individualists living in the Bronx. Basically, something to that effect. is like the core content of most of the things being said. Even though, ironically, Trotsky himself, besides, like I said before, besides schoolboy odd jobs, never lived a working class life himself. Trotsky's second article from Trotsky's second article, From a Scratch to the Danger of Gangrene, thrashed the theoretical enemy with physiological metaphor as his scornful rhetoric mounted. In December, when Trotsky invited Shachtman to Koyoakan to try to effect a meeting of minds, Shachtman declined. Consequently, Trotsky initiated a campaign of vilification that further revealed his anti-intellectualism and anti-Semitism. Interesting. He cast, quote, Jew, quote, petty bourgeois, and, quote, city intellectual in one hat and pleaded that, quote, the Jewish petty bourgeois element be shifted from their habitual conservative milieu and dissolved in the real movement, end quote. A persistent theme in the debate, lending credence to subsequent accusations of anti-Semitism. How did this old revolutionist answer the charge of conservatism? Trotsky said Burnham and company were the real conservatives. Burnham and company rejected Marxism itself. Moreover, Shachtman's, quote, philosophic block against Marxism, end quote, was compounded of, quote, intellectuals disillusioned with Bolshevism, end quote. His views were, quote, weak-kneed and capricious, end quote. Quote, the economics of the declassed petty bourgeoisie, end quote, based on, quote, arbitrary, not thought out, and downright false, end quote, historical instances. When the inevitable collapse should come, it would hurt both sides. Defending Cannon against allegations of clique leadership, Trotsky, cued by Cannonite Joseph Hansen, in Mexico. Let me look that up real quick. Yeah, Joseph Hansen. Joseph Leroy Hansen lived from 1910 to 1979, was an American Trotskyist and leading figure in the Socialist Workers' Party. Where am I? Back to the text. Defending Cannon against allegations of clique leadership, Trotsky, cued by Cannonite Hansen in Mexico, harped on the, quote, aberrant faction, end quote, which had, quote, existed uninterruptedly, statically, if not, quote, dynamically, end quote, concerned chiefly in, quote, combinations at the top, end quote, a phrase left unexplained. Actually, Aberrin had impeccable credentials which were hard to attack. In battling with Aberrin, Trotsky fought one of the three members of the Communist Central Committee who staked their party fortunes on his defense in 1928. Aberrin could boast as solidly American a background as Cannon's. In addition, his leftist political opinions had gotten him in hot water. A civil liberties lawyer once saved him from deportation. In Chicago in the 1920s, Aberrin served as a district leader in the Communist Party, and in New York in the mid-1930s, he was the Bronx branch organizer. Briefly, he allied with Must, McKinney, and others in questioning the wisdom of the French turn, but he stayed loyal to the party and set aside his doubts. Now, coached by Hansen, Trotsky insulted Aberrin for raising with Shachtman the quote, Russian question, end quote. No evidence, only accusation of a Martin Aberrin clique appeared in party records. Trotsky painted a picture of a party in real peril. Burnham sowed seeds of doubt about the linchpin of party theoretical structure, the dialectic, the, quote, eclectic, end quote, unprincipled Shachtman falsified party history, the, quote, dangerous, end quote, Aberrin led a clique, and all conspired to obstruct Bolshevik discipline and frustrate the true Marxian party. Both sides set to work in January 1940 to rally the vote for their resolutions at the spring convention slated for March. But since the combatants needed time to defend their cases at various branches and locals, an appeal to the National Committee got the convention postponed to April. Vigorous campaigning was begun. Cannon boasted that in February alone he had made 43 speeches and a total of 60 by April. He debated Shachtman again and again in meetings. Quote, in debating with Shachtman, I crawl my belly in the mud for the sake of the Fourth International, end quote, Cannon wrote. By February 20th, the mimeograph machine had churned out 11 special internal bulletins and would print out 4 more by April 5th, the opening date of the convention. To win the California locals, the National Committee launched Murray Weiss on a Western tour. Sorry, I think I might have already looked up Murray Weiss, but I'm going to do it again. I'm not saying anything like simple biographies, so carry on. CLR James left New York for Los Angeles without official authorization to present the minority viewpoint to Western comrades. Shachtman toured the Midwest, all the while heated letters to branches poured from Cannon's pen. Received cordially at other branches, Shachtman was rebuffed in the Twin Cities because the local was solidly with the majority from the beginning. Cannon wrote to Trotsky, quote, the Minneapolis comrades remain unmoved. They have read and studied all the bulletins and discussed them in meeting after meeting. They know Shachtman. They don't want to hear any more from Shachtman, end quote. The right to equal press coverage seemed basic. The minority pointed out that Bolshevik tradition permitted a free press. For instance, Carter remembered that Lenin allowed Bukharin a factional organ, and Trotsky had demanded a public press to state his positions in the 1920s. Even Cannon, just 2 years earlier, had demanded of the Socialist Party's National Executive Committee the right to an organ to present appeal caucus views. Capital A appeal, like the Socialist appeal. I believe that's what it's called. Because Trotsky insisted, the Cannonites finally compromised. On the editorial board of New International, the opposition could keep the 2 seats it already had out of the 5, but socialist appeal was closed to them. By the time this tiny token was offered, the fissure had grown too wide. The minority managed to keep the initiative they had grasped and to pick each patch of ground for skirmish. But Trotsky and Cannon ingeniously seized the political epithets thrown at them, quote, bureaucrats, quote, conservative, quote, factionalist, and aimed these back at the minority. Small incidents now loomed large, igniting flares of temperament and invoking volley of name-calling. Quote, traitors, quote, splitters, quote, liars were heard with increasing frequency. As an example of an insignificant episode ridiculously inflated, when one of Trotsky's dispatches was read aloud at a January meeting, Martin Aburn cried out, quote, this means split, end quote, then muttered that Trotsky treated the minority as, quote, second-class citizens, end quote. What ensued was a 4-corner exchange involving Aburn's denial, then Cannon's and Goldman's heated affirmations. Finally, Trotsky stepped in, vouched for Cannon's reliability, retorted that in labeling them the, quote, Cannon clique, end quote, the minority made, quote, second-class citizens, end quote, of the majority, and scolded Aburn for threatening split, quote, a despicable betrayal of the Fourth International, end quote. Aburn was not adept at writing the theoretical treatise so integral to the radical movement and to the present debate. But Trotsky had upbraided him. Aburn struck back, first defending Burnham's, quote, bureaucratic conservatism, end quote. That's the theory, not Burnham's bureaucratic conservatism himself that he had himself. It's referring to Burnham's theory, not to Burnham himself. Aburn struck back, first defending Burnham's, quote, bureaucratic conservatism, end quote, next dismissing the charge of an Aburnite clique as, quote, just palaver uttered by those who demonstrate a totalitarian concept of leadership, end quote. Burnham, Shachtman, and newcomer MacDonald, skilled in polemical exchange, lost no time in parrying Trotsky's blows. Accused of forming a bloc, Shachtman attacked on the historical front. Trotsky had himself belonged to factions having allied with opposition groupings in 1923, 1926, and 1927. He had said whoever rejected the dialectic was not a revolutionist and should not be in a combat party. In reply, Shachtman quoted Lenin, quote, this is from 1909, May 26, 1909, quote, this is from Lenin, a political party cannot examine its members to see if there are any contradictions between the philosophy and the political program, end quote. Lenin reminded Trotsky that Lenin had worked in a bloc with a philosopher who rejected Marx and that both had simply excluded philosophy as a neutral field. True, Burnham shunned dialectical materialism. Still, after the manner of Lenin, Trotsky, and the American Party, had for 5 years worked with him, even calling on him to employ his talents to write important party documents. Dwight MacDonald, a neophyte in the party, what the hell is a neophyte? Knew something. Is that just because he's new in the party? Okay, it's just a neophyte, a person who is new to a subject's skill or belief. Dwight MacDonald, a neophyte in the party but ardently pro-minority, attacked on the political front. Having had 3 articles rejected by the Internal Bulletin, in his experience a harder publication to break into than Fortune, Harper's, The Nation, New Yorker, or even New International, Dwight MacDonald thrust a mimeographed tract, Shamefaced Defensism, into intra-party circulation to prick Trotsky's balloon of, quote, principle, end quote. Trotsky's position on Russia was two-faced, he found. Outside the party, to keep his intelligent readership, he parlayed an anti-Stalinist line, yet in the Internal Bulletin, quote, for the unscrupulous and hypocritical sheep in the Cannon camp, end quote, he championed Stalinism, or seemed to. MacDonald's claim had truth, especially in the thick of this battle. In the party, Trotsky argued mainly for defense of a system he excoriated. It says manfully, I don't know if it's... it is manfully. In the party, Trotsky argued manfully for defense of a system he excoriated as degenerate and despotic outside it. Hansen called MacDonald's remarks, quote, slander, end quote. Trotsky called them, quote, guerrilla warfare, end quote. And MacDonald, amused, recalled that, quote, the article roused the majority to fury, not because of its arguments, which they paid no attention to, but simply because a nude boy had talked back to the principal, end quote. Wheeling out the biggest guns in the minority arsenal, James Burnham signed his name on the 1st of February to a scathing attack on the philosophic front, like shrapnel aimed in all directions, quote, science and style, end quote, accused Trotsky of confusing his followers and throwing a smokescreen over the 2 central issues, quote, the strategical orientation of the Fourth International in the present phase of the Second World War, end quote, and, quote, the question of the regime in the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. Trotsky used witty, flashy rhetoric and stentorian phrases such as, quote, the logic of events, end quote, the historic course of the struggle, end quote, to cloud an altogether unscientific analysis devoid of evidence. And why? Because the threads of his argument simply did not connect logically. As for Trotsky's displacing Aristotelian logic with Hegelian dialectic, Burnham sneered that Hegel, thrown out by modern scientists and mathematicians, except Russian ones, was, quote, the century-dead arch-muddler of human thought, end quote, whose dialectics had, quote, nothing whatever to do with science, end quote, and whose, quote, vision of a block universe, end quote, was totalitarian. After all, every faction from Euler through Martin Aburn and Shachtman to Stalin swore by the dialectic. The clincher should be that dialectics bore no relation to the questions at issue. Trotsky was also conservative, Burnham continued. The founding fathers of Marxism were sacrosanct to him. Like church authorities and state despots, Trotsky spoke of the dialectic as a, quote, fundamental question, end quote, and liberally used capitalized abstractions like capital F freedom, quote, capital G God, and, quote, capital T truth. An obscurantist and reactionary ploy, a, quote, red herring to divert attention from the political issues at stake, end quote. Analysis, not the dialectic, is the tool of modern science, and analysis insist on rigorous criticism of belief. There were 2 political, quote, fundamental questions, end quote, in the present struggle. What is our goal? How do we reach it? The antagonists agreed on the first question, but disagreed on the second. Canaanite idols had feet of clay. Hegel provided only words, and Trotsky resurrected hoary dogmas to solve modern problems. Burnham's assault grew more pointed when he confronted Trotsky's tactical blunders and personality failings. The old man pandered to, quote, backward provincialism, end quote, to prejudices against Jews and professors to win and hold his tenuous trade union following. As for the Trotsky canon, quote, anything goes, end quote, method, sanctioned for these tugs of war, quote, lies and disloyalty and slander, end quote, Burnham explained that socialism, a moral ideal, cannot be attained by means that corrupt. If the majority branded him, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, for this, he cared not a whit. To the devastating dissection of his methods, Trotsky had nothing substantive to say and only more name-calling. Burnham was a, quote, intellectual snob, end quote, a, quote, strutting pedant, end quote, one of the, quote, common swindlers in the field of politics, end quote. Burnham, Aborn, and Shachtman were, quote, bankrupt, end quote, purveyors of, quote, ideological charlatanism, end quote, and, quote, pompous phraseology, end quote. He hurled abuse, too, at former European supporters in scattered references. Trotsky plumbed the depths of his reservoir of invectives, becoming ridiculous as he flailed wildly at the American opposition. If you've listened to any of the pieces I've put up by Peter Bailhartz, that's precisely what he has to say as well. The April Convention, new section. While the war of words raged, the minority leaders met in Cleveland on February 24th and 25th. Trotsky, in desperation, wrote Al Goldman to urge unity. He honestly wished to avoid rupture, but would make only organizational, not political concessions. Obediently, Cannon wired the conferees that the majority, desirous of unity, would oppose any expulsions if after votes were taken they remained a majority. Moreover, they would make reasonable concessions, and if after the vote they became the new minority, they would, quote, maintain unity and discipline, end quote. Cannon requested a like pledge from the conferees, but none came. Instead, the Burnham Group prepared a resolution restating the issues from the minority viewpoint and granted each irreconcilable tendency the right to publicize its views. Trotsky and Cannon were certain now the minority fully intended to split formally. Quote, to impose a factional organ on us is to impose a Norman Thomas all-inclusive party on us. A perpetual talk shop which they know we can't allow, end quote, said the Cannonites. Through March, each side arched its back and declared that the other prepared a split. Because they refused equal space in New International and Socialist Appeal, then censored from the internal bulletin and now denied a factional organ, the minority, quote, knew, end quote, the Cannonites' intended rupture. Since November, I said this in November, there's no November here. Since July 1939, Cannon had prevented discussion. When the pressure of events forced discussion on Cannon hoped to confine debate to one meeting of the New York local and supposedly succeeded in damping controversy in the Minnesota, Michigan, and Ohio locals. The correspondence showed that Cannon labored for a month to prepare his factions psychologically for split. Unlike Trotsky, who wanted to give limited concessions to keep the party intact, Cannon felt no aversion to separation. Shachtman claimed that Cannon was reconciled to split from the beginning of the quarrel. Quote, let's have a cold split, Max, end quote, Cannon reportedly said in the fall of 1939 in a, quote, friendly, cynical, personal discussion between him and one of his comrades on one side in his office and Burnham and me on the other side, end quote. Reluctant to incur the displeasure of Trotsky, who wanted unity, Cannon later tried to explain the incident away by saying he was joking, but Shachtman insisted that on the basis of his 20-year acquaintance with Cannon, he knew Cannon was serious. As Shachtman recalled it, because the minority not only challenged Trotsky's political stand, but also challenged the organizational status quo, Cannon reasoned that his own position would stay secure if they would go ahead and leave the party. Outside, they would be a minor nuisance. Inside, they would be, quote, an unendurable thorn in his side. So he did nothing to avert a split. On the eve of the convention, Cannon circulated his bitterest diatribe. Quote, "The struggle for a proletarian party," end quote, recapitulated the events connected with the dispute in the manner in which, quote, "war and bureaucratic conservatism," end quote, had done this for the minority. By now, quote, petty bourgeois intellectual, quote, cliquism, quote, bureaucratism, quote, conservatism, the, quote, leader cult, and the rest of the repertory were too familiar phrases, but Cannon trotted them out again, describing, quote, intellectualist insurrection, end quote, in a tiresome 82-page recital calculated, in case letters, speeches, and the internal bulletin had failed, to win the last hesitant few to his position. The minority leaders participated fully in the April convention, watching their resolution for a factional organ go down in defeat. In the final session, 4 resolutions passed, one a lengthy document contrived to instruct the dissenters, reaffirmed democratic centralism, and set forth membership duties to yield loyalty, labor, and material resources to the party's ongoing task. Final paragraphs proclaimed the right to regimentation of party discussions and prescribed expulsion for anyone reviving a matter closed by majority decision. A second resolution warned that the factional organ demanded by the minority would make the Socialist Workers' Party an all-inclusive party. The Cannonites must keep the helm or the party would go under, pulled down by enemy agents and infiltrators. Commands followed threats. The particularly corruptible student comrades must be proletarianized. Members must get jobs at once in factories and mills and integrate themselves into, quote, union and workers' mass organizations and unemployed leagues, end quote. Such orders reveal the hysterical majority's incredible naivete. One source of the incurable frailty of radical movements in America for continuing the resolution explained that these actions were mandatory because, quote, "the working class is the only class in modern society that is progressive and truly revolutionary. Only the working class is capable of saving humanity from barbarism," end quote. After making this sweeping sociological pronouncement, the resolution offered dissenters either the carrot of revolutionary camaraderie or the stick of expulsion. A third resolution rejected, quote, "the attempt of the petty bourgeois minority to impose its will," end quote, in the matter of a factional publication, and ordered expulsion of members caught violating the decision, even expulsion of entire units ignoring the order to eject disobedient individuals. A final one reiterated the pledge Cannon had wired to the minority conference, offering seats on the political committee, space in New International, and joint editorship of the internal bulletin, all concessions for party harmony. As a last admonition, assuming the, quote, carrot, end quote, would be declined, the resolution officially, quote, closed, end quote, the discussion on organization and warned members to honor strictest discipline. The vote upheld the majority 55 to 31. As Cannon phrased it, the minority was forced to accept the decisions, quote, or go on their way and unfurl their own banner, end quote. The convention over, Shachtman, Burnham, and Aberrin still remained in the party. No one had so much as raised the Russian or, quote, political, end quote, question. No one debated the validity of the, quote, third camp, end quote, idea or the existence of a new bureaucratic class in Russia or whether or not Russia was imperialist. The political issues had been totally eclipsed by this, the question of leadership power versus membership rights. Yet the nature of Russia and the onset of war had triggered the crisis. The Russian question had simply forced the subterranean currents of discontent to the surface. Cannon said the minority had succumbed to the bourgeois environment. Cannon may have been right. Burnham believed he influenced the others, and he had been first, after all, to question several hollowed tenets. Shachtman conceded that Burnham had swayed him, and George Novak, who remained with Cannon, reflected that Burnham unquestionably led the minority faction. After a year's dispute that rose to higher and higher levels of shrillness and sank to lower and lower levels of invective, the Socialist Workers' Party, veteran of 5 years out in the open political arena, now slowly turned around and began its retreat into the shell. The promise of party reform, a faint glow even in its ruddiest moments, flickered erratically from July through March and was at last snuffed out in April. At a political committee meeting on the 16th of April, the suspensions took place. Far more arbitrary was the majority against his faction. Shachtman recalled, than were the Lovestonites against the Trotskyists in 1928, for the Lovestonites allowed their adversaries to defend themselves against real charges at a trial. Now there were no charges and no trial. The minority faced two short motions at the meeting. The first declared that if the minority did not vote for the two motions, all of them would be out of the party. The second motion, quote, fantastic, end quote, said Shachtman, provided that if the minority did not vote for the first motion, they would be out. Quote, we abstained from voting and we were promptly expelled. I recall Cannon took a look at his watch, turned to his friends at that time and said, quote, 3 minutes, end quote. He was proud of the fact that the whole split had taken only 3 minutes to carry through, end quote. Technically, the minority remained in the party, but under suspension until they should mend their ways. On the 20th of April 1940, in the Socialist Appeal, the National Committee explained that the act was taken, quote, to protect the party against disruption, end quote. Fourth International, the journal, on May 19th, endorsed suspension, repeating the official stand on the nature of the Soviet state and Bolshevik organization, and recommended a month's time for the suspended members to reconsider, signify acceptance of convention decisions, and be reinstated as party members in good standing. Otherwise, unconditional expulsion would be imposed. By September, several faction members had taken that course, and more would return yet later. But the theoretical leaders had removed themselves even further from the Cannonites by that time, and so were expelled officially at the plenum held that month in Chicago. Cannon came perilously close to believing he and he alone had saved the proletarian party from ruin. It had been necessary to throw out the corrupting petty bourgeois intellectuals, and he engineered the ouster without the full sanction of Trotsky. Far from deciding terms from afar when the issue was power in the American party, Trotsky was a child in the hands of Cannon. C.L.R. James, expelled with the minority, agreed that Cannon played the decisive role. In James's estimation, Trotsky was politically inept no matter whom he tangled. In this instance, Trotsky's authority and energy were unscrupulously used for an aim Trotsky did not have in mind. Quote, when he recognized what was happening, it was too late, end quote, James ruminated. Shachtman concurred. True, Cannon's criticism of the Burnham group came from Trotsky, whose arguments he, quote, repeated without change, end quote, when they concerned the Russian question. But on the organizational matter, Cannon had his own viewpoint founded in part on old antipathies, and he, quote, followed that point of view to the end, end quote, ignoring Trotsky, who did not want the minority hounded out of the party. He, quote, didn't want to drive Shachtman out of the Trotskyist movement or Aburn or even Burnham, end quote. But because Cannon was present at the helm and Trotsky was miles away, Cannon's plan succeeded. The Socialist Workers' Party split, quote, right down the middle, 50-50, end quote. The former minority faction taking 40% of the membership, including prominent intellectuals, and 80% of the Young People's Socialist League. Before split, membership had variously reported around 800 to 1,000. Sorry, let me repeat the start of this again. The Socialist Workers' Party split, quote, right down the middle, 50-50, end quote. The former minority faction taking 40% of the membership, including prominent intellectuals, and 80% of the Young People's Socialist League. Before split, membership was variously reported as around 800 to 1,000, quote, hardcore faithful, end quote. Afterward, the saving remnant of the proletarian party was tiny indeed, even though Hansen recorded a 25% increase 6 months later. In 1941, this minuscule band temporarily was to lose 18 leaders, tried, convicted, and imprisoned under the Smith Act. Where am I? One second. Shachtman and Burnham immediately formed the new Workers' Party, and considered themselves Trotskyists despite the withdrawal of Trotsky's blessing. Canaanites scornfully branded them a, petty bourgeois semi-pacifist sect, end quote. For one of their organs, they revived Labor Action, and for the other, they merely continued publishing under the same title, New International, of which both had been editors anyway. Shachtman avoided explaining how this came about, but the Socialist Workers' Party National Committee had charged that they stole New International, usurped and appropriated New International for revenge, and made New International a counterfeit sheet devoid of the Bolshevik-Leninist stamp. Although the journal legally belonged with the Canon Party, because its name was sullied, the Socialist Workers' Party washed its hands of it and embarked with a, clean banner, end quote. Fittingly, they chose the title Fourth International. For a time, subscribers to New International received the two publications because both circulation managers honored unexpired subscriptions. For 8 years, the Workers' Party kept going, but without the presence of James Burnham, who 1 month after its founding renounced Marxism altogether. Then in 1948, concluding that to consider themselves a party was self-deception, the comrades renamed themselves the Independent Socialist League, keeping their fortnightly and their quarterly. In 1958, every one of the Shachtmanites, end quote, joined the Socialist Party, where Shachtman reported in 1962, all, are to be found to this day, end quote. I don't know if that's precisely true, because that's definitely not the case for people like Hal Draper and the New Politics people, to my understanding at least. Maybe the New Politics people did join the Socialist Party, but I don't think so. What about Hal Draper and Julius Jacobson? New section. Loss of the leader. As an exile for 12 years, Trotsky was hounded, despised, feared, and accused of collusion with the fascists by the Stalinist government to discredit him, in the eyes of the world proletariat, end quote. Before being granted asylum in Mexico, Trotsky shuttled from his native Russia through Turkestan, Turkey, France, and Norway. Fate was to give Trotsky 3.5 years in Mexico, but those would be no more serene than had been the preceding ones. Trotsky knew he was targeted for extermination. Trotsky's son, at age 32, died mysteriously in France in 1938. Infuriated, then saddened at length, mellowed by word of the death, he proceeded to transform his living quarters into a veritable fortress manned around the clock by sentries. The fuck is a sentry? It's just guards? A soldier stationed to keep guard or control access to the place. It was in the line of this duty that 20-year-old Joseph Hansen came to Coyoacán in early 1940. If you don't know what Coyoacán is, it's a neighborhood. I think it might have been more of an independent city at this time, but it was I think now it's more considered a neighborhood of Mexico City, or part of Mexico City. At this time, it might have been something comparable to a suburb. I'm not sure though. As a Canaanite, Hansen doubtless described for Trotsky the crisis in the Socialist Workers' Party skewed on the side of the majority and perhaps sparked Trotsky's bitter diatribes against Burnham, Shachtman, and Aberrin. Hansen's personal responsibility, if he bore any, for the ensuing rupture cannot be gauged. But whatever his role in the affair, he performed the inestimable service of recording in Fourth International the chronology of events leading to the assassination, leaving for posterity the only connected continuous account. Communist papers campaigned to deport Trotsky as, an enemy of Mexico, end quote, as a, espionage agent in their midst in the service of Wall Street, end quote. Almost a recluse, he, Natalia, and his grandson made occasional surreptitious motor tours of the Mexican countryside, but the pleasure was marred by ever-present armed guards. One of his last letters to Charles Curtis in Los Angeles mentioned that he had just received a bulletproof vest and a, wonderful siren, end quote. Aside from a few diversions, Trotsky eked out his days behind 20-foot walls in political conversations with a stream of carefully screened visitors and in writing his chief labor. One early morning in May 1940, this regimen was violently interrupted when intruders scaled the wall and riddled his bedroom with bullets, then bombed his grandson's bedroom. The Trotskys eluded death this time, but they knew it would happen again. Police arrested the terrorists in 2 weeks with leads supplied by Trotsky. two men on the staff of the communist journal Future, David Alfaro Siqueiros and Lombardo Toledano, dressed as police, had led the raid. I looked up David Alfaro Siqueiros is how I said actually. David Alfaro Siqueiros, who lived from 1896 to 1974, was a Mexican social realist painter best known for his large public murals using the latest in equipment, materials, and technique, along with Diego Rivera and Jose Clemente Orozco. He was one of the most famous of the, quote, Mexican muralists, end quote. Siqueiros was a member of the Mexican Communist Party. Although Siqueiros went to Spain to support the Spanish Republic against the forces of Francisco Franco with his art, he volunteered and served in frontline combat as lieutenant colonel in the Army of the Republic through 1938 before returning to Mexico City. In 1940, Siqueiros led a failed assassination attempt on Leon Trotsky, in which Trotsky's 14-year-old grandson was shot and American communist Robert Sheldon Hart was executed. After spending several months on the run from Mexican authorities disguised as a peasant, Siqueiros was eventually apprehended in Jalisco, although he would never be brought to trial and was freed shortly. By accordance with the Spanish naming customs, his surname would normally have been Alfaro. However, like Picasso, Pablo Ruiz y Picasso, and Lorca, Federico Garcia Lorca, Siqueiros used his mother's surname. It was long believed that he was born in Camargo in Chihuahua state, but in 2003 it was proven that he had actually been born in the city of Chihuahua, but grew up in Irapuato, Guanajuato, at least from the age of 6. The discovery of his birth certificate in 2003 by Mexican art curator was announced the following year by art critic Raquel Tibol, who was renowned as the leading authority on Mexican muralism and who had been a close acquaintance of Siqueiros. Siqueiros changed his given name to David after his first wife called him by an allusion to Michelangelo's David. He was awarded the Lenin Peace Prize in 1966, it says here. Oh, what a fucking piece of shit. And who's this other person? Lombardo Toledano. Does Haymarket have a book about this guy? Or am I making that up? Yeah, In Combat. Vincent Lombardo Toledano is the founding member of numerous labor union organizations in Mexico and Latin America. Vicente Lombardo Toledano lived from 1894 to 1968 and was one of the foremost Mexican labor leaders of the 20th century, called, quote, the dean of Mexican Marxism and the best-known link between Mexico and the international world of Marxism and socialism, end quote. In 1936, Vicente Lombardo Toledano founded the Confederation of Mexican Workers, the National Labor Federation most closely associated with the ruling party founded by President Lázaro Cárdenas, the Party of the Mexican Revolution, PRM. After Vicente Lombardo Toledano was purged from the Union after World War II, Lombardo Toledano co-founded the political party Partido Popular along with Narciso Bassols, which later became known as the Partido Popular Socialista. Okay, so that was that was some biographical information on those individuals. Sorry, there's a couple names that I just want to look up here. The other one is Robert Sheldon Hart. Robert Sheldon Hart lived from 1915 to 1940 and was an American communist who worked as one of Leon Trotsky's assistants and bodyguards in Coyoacan, Mexico. During the Stalinist attack against Trotsky's household on the 24th of May 1940, Hart was abducted and later murdered by the Stalinist agents. Hart was 25 years old when he offered his services as a guard to the Trotsky household. He replaced the American Trotskyist Alexander Bookman. He was described as popular and that, although not an intellectual, he carried out any tasks without complaints. So it says, back to the text. Okay, the two men on the staff of the communist journal Future, David Alfaro Siqueiros and Lombardo Toledano, dressed as police, had led the raid. The sentry on duty, Robert Sheldon Hart, had granted the disguised men their entry. Several days after their apprehension, police found Hart's body in a shallow grave near the home of Siqueiros' friend. Did Hart entirely innocently open the gates to Siqueiros? Was an organization behind his first assassination attempt? Was it self-assault planned by Trotsky or Toledano charged before his arrest? The Communist Party denied complicity. One account protested that Hart, a communist turncoat, newly arrived from Russia, had been paid a fabulous sum by an unknown malefactor to carry out the betrayal. Another portrayed him as a disenchanted Trotskyist. Neither bears scrutiny, for a lone conspirator could hardly have gathered together 25 men for the nefarious errand. Hart probably remained either a loyal communist carrying out his assignment only to be disposed of ingloriously as potential talebearer at its conclusion, or a loyal Trotskyist, a novitate sentry opening the gate in all innocence. Does that just mean novice? Is that what novitate means? Period or state of being a novice, especially in a religious order. The idea of Hart's complicity is interesting here, for not only was Hart a member of the executive committee of local New York, but he was selected for guard duty in Mexico because of his trustworthiness. Only 24 years old and scion of a wealthy New York family, Hart had said a rally against the German-American Bundists in Madison Square Garden first lured him to the Socialist Workers' Party. Trotsky hotly denied rumors that Hart secretly associated with Stalinists, despite rumors, indeed perhaps because of them, and as if to prove them false, the Socialist Workers' Party sent him to Trotsky's side. Their official stand in the 1970s held absolutely to a belief in his fidelity and innocence. Trotsky affixed a plaque in Hart's memory in one of the fortified towers constructed to thwart a second assassination attempt, but police investigation suggested Hart's involvement. Later, Natalia Trotsky talking with Shachtman showed that she had wavered and conceded Hart's likely collusion with Siqueiros. Precisely for what reason she could not say in the absence of clear evidence. Danger lurked inside the Socialist Workers' Party, but it was not, as Trotsky believed, the, quote, petty bourgeois minority, end quote. It was, and Trotsky suspected this too, infiltration by enemies bent on destroying its leader. Several years before, the Communist Party patiently inaugurated action to that end, quite apart from Siqueiros' scheme. Louis Boudens recorded the outline of events. Who is Louis Boudens? Louis Boudens. Louis Boudens lived from 1891 to 1972 and was an American activist and writer. Louis Boudens began as a labor activist and became a member of the Communist Party USA. In 1945, Boudens renounced communism, became a vocal anti-communist, appearing as an expert witness at governmental hearings and writing about his experiences. Louis Boudens recorded the outline of events. First, the party, quote, sent, end quote, a woman member into the Chicago branch of the Socialist Party, where she won the trust of her Trotskyist comrades. It then sent her to New York, obtaining a job for her with a Stalinist, a woman doctor, quote, to help her explain peculiar hours and regular income, end quote. Befriending Cannon's wife, Rose Karsner, she soon, quote, had the full run of the Trotskyite offices, end quote, from which she supplied the Soviet secret police with copies of all correspondence with Trotsky in Mexico and with other Trotskyists throughout the world. The Communist Party then placed Ruby Weil in the Trotskyist Party to befriend and gain the confidence of the three Agaloff sisters of New York. Ruth Agaloff served as Trotsky's secretary in Mexico. Sylvia, a former social worker, was a courier to Trotskyists in Canada, Europe, and Mexico. Hilda, working in the New York local, was available for Weil's attention. Ruby Weil allegedly performed her errand ignorant of its full implications. Boudin's claimed she thought her effort was to stop Trotsky's infiltration into Russia and thus prevent Stalin's assassination. Accompanying Sylvia Agaloff to Paris to the founding conference of the Fourth International in September 1938, Weil there introduced Agaloff to a spurious, quote, Count Jacques Mornard, alias Ramon Marcador. Marcador had been primed for his role. He's who actually... Isn't he who actually assassinates Trotsky, or is that someone else? Ramon Mercader lived from 1913 to 1978, was a Spanish communist and NKVD secret agent who assassinated the revolutionary Leon Trotsky in Mexico City in August 1940. Mercader was imprisoned for 19 years and 8 months in Mexico for murdering the exiled detractor with an ice axe. In 1960, Ramon Mercader was released from Mexican imprisonment. Mercader was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal and Order of Lenin Medal and lived at different times in Cuba, the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia. Back to the text. Agaloff and Mercader, the spellings are different. It's in Mercader, Mercader, on Wikipedia, and in the text it's Mercador. So there's an O at the between the R and in the text, and there's an E between the R, D and the R on Wikipedia. Agaloff and Mercader traveled to Mexico together in late 1939, but now Mercader had a new alias, Frank Jackson. Jackson posed as a party sympathizer, so of course Agaloff gained him entry to Trotsky's household. Hansen recollected that he, quote, appeared nervous, prematurely aged, end quote, and that he could not carry on a sustained political conversation. His interest in party affairs soared during the struggle that ended in schism in April 1940. After acquainting himself with the issues, Jackson scribbled out a rough draft for an article and gave it on the August 17th to Trotsky for criticism. Hansen claimed Trotsky confided to Natalia and his comrades that it was poor, but he hated to discourage the man. Jackson, Mercader, returned on the August 20th with the finished essay, quote, The Third Camp and the Popular Front, end quote. Shachtman noted, it's really depressing to recall that the article was directed against us, the minority, denouncing us poor devils, end quote. But these matters were still uppermost in Trotsky's mind. In fact, these final days he spent dictating an article in response to one by Dwight MacDonald. Arriving about 5 p.m., quote, very, very nervous, end quote, Natalia Trotsky recalled, Jackson, Mercader met Trotsky and they entered the study. As Trotsky read the article, the assassin drew the woodsman's axe from his overcoat and with it struck Trotsky's skull, then his face. At first, the wounds appeared superficial. Actually, Trotsky lived 22 hours, talking for 2.5 of them, admonishing that Jackson should be forced to, quote, speak out, end quote. But the axe had destroyed much brain tissue. Trotsky dictated his last comments in a failing voice to Hansen, quote, I am sure the victory of the Fourth International, ... go forward, end quote. And if part of the account of the last hours slides over into Apocrypha, it is perhaps unimportant, for the man has become something of a legend anyway. Sorry. On the 22nd of August, a funeral was held according to Mexican custom. Al Goldman, Gundizio Muniz, and other Spanish-speaking comrades delivered the eulogies, but the remains were not interned until August 27th, pending the outcome of a request to the United States government to allow the body to be taken to New York for a funeral service. It was refused. Mercador's trial stretched out over nearly 2 years, one ruse after another devised for delay. Mercador's first posed as a disillusioned Trotskyist, unhappy when ordered to Russia on a mission of sabotage and murder. Mercador next pleaded self-defense, charging that the volatile Trotsky struck at him in rage. But he was convicted, and Shachtman believed his connection with the Soviet secret police was substantiated because when released from prison after the Fidel Castro revolution in Cuba, he proceeded to Havana by boat there to be met at the dock by Che Guevara, Fidel Castro's chief lieutenant. I'm going to copy that. Sorry. Just want to put this down somewhere. Yeah, that's probably... The details of assassination were included here for 2 reasons. First, members of the American Trotskyist unit were closely involved as sentries, guards, secretaries, even conspirators in Mexico, one being an unwitting accomplice of the assassin. The fact that conspirators and assassins' accomplices could proceed undetected reveals the very turbulent, hence vulnerable position of the movement during those years of fusion, fragmentation, and schism, and reveals Trotsky's pathetic yearning to hold fast to his small following and entice more into his fold. Second, Trotsky's death brings the curtain down with finality on one phase of his movement in America. Trotsky believed the founding conference of the Fourth International in 1938 had inaugurated a glorious new era for the communist opposition. Instead, it presaged by only 2 years its retreat, its step backward to become once more a propaganda sect, but a far less promising and interesting one than it had been from 1928 to 1934. Its writers, its theoretical leadership, most of those with a flair for political analysis, left the party in April 1940. Then, with Trotsky's assassination in August, the remaining core lost its principal touchstone, the arch-theoretician of the movement. Trotsky, of course, anticipated the final blow. Apparently, Stalin thought his existence was a growing menace to his regime in the face of European war. Trotsky simply knew too much. For one thing, the Dies Committee in October 1939 had invited him to testify before it, and he had accepted. True, before the scheduled date of appearance, November 12th, because the State Department refused Trotsky a visa, the committee first postponed, then rescinded the invitation. Nonetheless, J.B. Matthews, chief investigator, planned a trip to Mexico to take a deposition from him, and of course Trotsky intended to disclose what he knew of the Soviet secret police's control of world communist parties. For another thing, Trotsky was putting together his defense against libel charges brought by the Communist Party of Mexico, a further opportunity to bring to light the collection of affidavits and other records he had collected for years on the secret police's operations. A third possible reason was his continuing labor in its final stages on a biography of Joseph Stalin, still another potential vehicle for revelations. Trotsky did literally die for his political reviews, remarked Mary McCarthy. Trotsky's views, hate on both sides of the spectrum, coupled with his theoretical genius and magnetism, destined him for martyrdom. Trotsky's very amiability and serenity came as, quote, a last straw, end quote, to the killer. In 1976, a group of English Trotskyists in the London-based Workers' Revolutionary League leveled charges against Joseph Hansen and George Novak, quote, desperate men, end quote, for laxity in defending Trotsky's person and for likely complicity with Hart and the Soviet secret police. Hansen and Novak declined to answer the far-fetched indictment. Probably for years ahead, questions will be raised about Trotsky's death, for mystery still surrounds several details. After August 20th, 1940, the big question is whether Trotskyism would survive the death of Trotsky. Certainly the American Trotskyists had taken two stunning blows. Despite the stolidity and intransigence of the Socialist Workers' Party displayed in weathering the Smith Act trial and conviction of 1941, and its flurries of trade union activity from 1942 to 1947, the theoretical sterility and blunting of political alertness that took place in 1940 was not made good until perhaps the late 1960s, with the party's revived attraction and the emergence of a new theoretical generation, but that is another story. Thanks for listening.